was, as you all know, justice at the Constitutional Court in Germany. And then there will be a comment by Chief Justice Barak, and then we'll have an open discussion, so you could ask questions, attack, or do whatever you want. Mikhail.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mikhail Karayani. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law. So Professor Grimm, Professor Barak, Elika, colleagues, friends, and guests, welcome. I'm truly honored to offer my greetings to all of you on this very special occasion, the launching of this lecture series honoring Aharon Barak, and to be called the Aharon Barak Annual Lecture. Aharon Barak is the most prominent lawyer, legal scholar, and judge in Israel of his generation. A full professor at the Hebrew University at the age of 36, even prior to this, Barak was already known as an international expert in civil law, chairing important international committees in his field. Barak was appointed as Attorney General of Israel at the age of 39, and 3 years later, in 1978, he was appointed to the Israeli Supreme Court. In 1995, he was nominated as the President of the Supreme Court of Israel and served in this position until his retirement in 2006. Barak is considered to be one of the most brilliant and fruitful legal scholars of our time. As a judge, Barak was the driving force behind the fundamental transformation of Israeli law throughout the last 40 years, and the rise of the Supreme Court as an influential and central institution. His decisions have shaped almost every field of law in this country. While Barak began his career as an expert in civil and commercial law, as a judge, he soon became the most influential figure on the bench in public and constitutional law. Subsequently, Barak became increasingly interested in international law as well. Throughout his career as a justice, Barak did not cease his work as a legal scholar and published numerous books on legal interpretation and methodology, proportionality, human rights, judges in democracy, and what have you. Barak began his association with the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University as a law student in 1955, going on to become a faculty member and a dean of the faculty between 1974 and 1975. As an Attorney General and Justice of the Supreme Court, Barak continued to teach at the faculty, and he regards the faculty not only as his alma mater, but also as his intellectual home. It was thus only natural that upon Barak's retirement from the bench, the faculty decided to honor his commitment and devotion to the Hebrew University in his contribution to Israeli law and society throughout the establishment of the Aharon Barak Center for Interdisciplinary Legal Research. I'm very happy to inform you that the endowment of the center was doubled this year thanks to the special efforts of the American Friends of the Hebrew University.
And the dean of this.
To Aharon Barak. And thanks to this additional gift, we were able to establish this lecture series and also incorporate within the mandate of the Aharon Barak Center for Interdisciplinary Legal Research the whole field of empirical legal studies, a field that our faculty is so blessed in having a unique group of faculty members working in. I would like to take this opportunity and thank Professor Grimm for accepting our invitation and give the inaugural lecture of the series on a timely topic in many countries, certainly here in Israel. So without further ado, thank you all for coming, and I wish us all a fruitful discussion and lecture. Thank you. Now, you can take my seat.
I will take your seat, definitely. Es ist mir eine große Ehre, Professor Dieter Grimm vorzustellen. Ich habe seine Schreiben gelesen und ich gekonnte und er hat mir Influencer, aber ich habe nicht persönlich getroffen. Dieter Grimm is a professor of law at Humboldt University of Berlin and a permanent fellow and former director of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, Institute for Advanced Study, which actually I have the honor of being a fellow there next year. I'm very happy about it. I don't know if this has to do with you or anybody else. But,
objective process.
From 1987 until 1999, he served as a justice on the Federal Constitutional Court, and I had the opportunity of reading many of his decisions, including the famous decision some of you may know on the German plane, which I think is a very deep, very sophisticated philosophical decision. Interestingly wrong in some ways, interestingly right in other ways, and fantastic decision. And I highly recommend the translation of this decision to English. And I think it has given rise to many, many scholarly articles, which I find quite fantastic. And this is both a fantastic jurisprudential text and also a fantastic philosophical text, if I may say. Professor Grimm would speak about a very important issue. It's called Under Pressure, Gerichter unter politischer Druck. I'm going to say something that some of you may find controversial. If I don't say it, I will lose my reputation as somebody who only says controversial things. I sense that Israel is following very quickly the example of Hungary and Poland. The government and the Knesset are power hungry, and they wish to control every aspect of Israel, in every aspect of life in Israel. Universities, the civil society, the courts. Our government has started the process of murdering the independence of every dimension of civil society and other institutions, such as the courts. Insights from the very effective, I think, judicial system in Germany may help us to save and maybe even to rebuild from scratch what has been destroyed in the last few years. I don't know if you find it controversial, but some people may find it controversial. Thank you very much. Professor Grimm, bitte.
Ladies and gentlemen, after having heard what the Dean just said about Aharon Barak, I am even more proud that I was selected to give this inaugural lecture on honoring the inauguration of the Institute. Towards the end of the 20th century, it looked as if constitutionalism had established itself definitely around the world. Many countries had freed themselves from dictatorship or authoritarian governments, racist governments, military regimes, and had transformed themselves into liberal democracies. New constitutions were adopted all over the world. Old ones were thoroughly rewritten. And I think also the willingness to take constitution seriously grew during that time. An indicator may be that almost all of these new constitutions decided in favor of judicial review, be it by specialized constitutional courts, be it by general Supreme Courts. I was a member, as it was already mentioned, of the German Supreme Court at that time. And delegation after delegation was traveling to Karlsruhe. The German Constitutional Court sits not in Berlin, but in Karlsruhe. First, the parliamentary committees that were charged with drafting new constitutions. Later on, the newly established constitutional courts. And asked why travel to Germany and not to Washington. The usual answer was that Germany emerged from a deep fall, emerged as a stable and prosperous democracy where the constitution mattered. And most of these delegates had the impression that this might have something to do with the basic law and perhaps with the jurisprudence of the Federal Constitutional Court. And consequently, there was one question that virtually every delegation brought up in the discussion with the justices of my court, and the question was, how does one manage that politicians comply with the judgments of the court even when they deeply disagree with these judgments? And I remember that some of my colleagues referred to a provision of the statute on the Constitutional Law Court, precisely paragraph 31, which says judgments of the Constitutional Court are binding for every branch of government. But this apparently was not the answer that the delegates expected, and I think the answer rather is that the success of constitutionalism and the success of judicial review has a number of extra legal preconditions, especially the order that is established by the Constitution has to be more or less accepted. There has to be a general willingness to follow the law, even if it frustrates the plans of politicians. There has to be a rule of law mindedness, and certainly not the least important, there has to be a backing of the Constitutional Court in the society for which this court renders its judgment, so that it is too costly for politicians to openly disobey judgments of the court. And it was quite clear, if one was aware that these preconditions exist, it was quite clear already at that time that in many of these new liberal democracies, the preconditions were lacking. Today, the constitutional world looks different. The consequence of the lacking roots of constitutionalism and of judicial review become visible. Constitutions are reformed in an illiberal way or are openly disregarded. Constitutional courts are disabled or brought in line with the rulers. And this is my subject for today, and I hope that it is an appropriate subject for the occasion, namely the inauguration of one of the most impressive judges I have ever met in my life, and he's sitting next to me here. But before turning to political pressure on courts, especially courts with the power to review laws, I would like to ask the question, why judicial adjudication, why judicial review was established in the first place? After all, there is no court with the power of judicial review if not established by constitution makers or lawmakers, it as politicians in the first place. I think in Israel, I may have to add, at least in the overwhelming numbers of countries. Everybody knows that in the United States, the Supreme Court was not explicitly authorized in the text of the Constitution to review laws. Judicial review in the US is the result of a judgment of the US Supreme Court 16 years after the adoption of the Constitution, Marbury versus Madison. However, the idea was not alien to Americans. The famous paper number 78 of the Federalist Papers clearly foresaw judicial review, and Chief Justice Marshall didn't invent it out of the blue, but it derived it from Constitution as higher law, a law that emanates from the people, and Trump's law that emanates only from the representatives of the people. And Aharon Barak's opinion in United Mizrahi Bank may be something like the Israeli Marbury versus Madison. But these are exceptions. The vast majority of countries are in a situation where constitutional adjudication was deliberately adopted by politicians. So it was an act of self-limitation of politicians, and I think it is an interesting question to ask, why do they do it? Why do they do it? The father of modern specialized constitutional review, Hans Kelsen, derived it from his theory of the, I look into one direction. I didn't know that you were here when I thought about it, but I hoped you were here.
I would have told him had you not been here.
So, Kelsen derived it theoretically from his idea of the Stufenbau der Rechtsordnung. Every legal norm, every legal act derives its legal force from an authorization by a higher norm and is valid only if it stays within the framework of the authorization. The question whether this is the case, according to Kelsen, is a typical question for the judiciary to answer. Legislative power derives its power from the Constitution. That's to say, constitutional review for Kelsen is the logical consequence of Constitution. At a certain point, he says, a Constitution without such an enforcement mechanism is almost like not having a Constitution at all. However, Kelsen was not the constitution maker in Austria. Post-War I Austria, he prepared the draft. The decision was taken by others, but apparently he convinced politicians so that Austria became the first country to adopt specialized constitutional review. On a broader scale, judicial review was introduced only after World War II, and certainly not by chance, primarily by the losers of World War II, that's to say Japan, Italy, and Germany. Japan is a special case. The Japanese constitution was drafted in Washington, translated into Japanese and sent over and adopted there. But Germany and Italy are different, and there it was a voluntary, free decision of the constitution makers that there should be a constitutional court in post-war Germany as well as in post-war Italy. The background in both cases, of course, is the experience of the destruction of democratic constitutionalism and the experience of a dictatorship where all the assets of constitutionalism were disregarded: limited government, rule of law, separation of powers, fundamental rights. There was strong conviction after the end of World War II of never again the self-destruction of a democracy, never again the total neglect of fundamental rights as it had happened in the 12 years before. And the way to make this never again effective was the Constitution. I think one can understand the German Basic Law only if it is seen as an endeavor to prevent the Weimar experience from repeating itself. And part of the conviction was that constitutions, if constitutions should matter, there has to be an enforcement mechanism. So the adoption of judicial review in 1949 in the German Basic Law was almost uncontroversial. The only opponents, a handful of communist deputies in the parliamentary council. And the same is true for many countries that later on adopted judicial review. Established constitutional courts after the collapse of dictatorial regimes of all sorts in the second half of the 20th century. Constitution makers were inspired by the idea of limited government and by the necessity of safeguards against the inclination of rulers to disregard limits. So one can call this an idealistic motive for establishing constitutional courts and judicial review. In more recent times, the literature on constitutional courts and judicial adjudication, this idealistic explanation, although I think it is correct, finds a lot of criticism. There are some authors who favor a more realistic approach. Van Hirschel is perhaps the most prominent name, Tom Ginsburg, Myla Versteeg, and others. In their view, constitution makers and lawmakers in general are rational actors who, by establishing constitutional courts, pursue their own interest in securing the predominance of their own ideas and their own groups, even if they lose their majority in future elections. Constitutional adjudication, according to these actors, is a hegemonic project. The permanence of the judiciary, the long tenure of the judges, that extends over several legislative periods, makes constitutional courts an attractive tool in preventing the opposition from making widespread changes, even if the opposition becomes the majority. As a matter of fact, countries where these motives may have played a role exist. France, the Fifth Republic, under de Gaulle's leadership, may be an example where the court was created as an instrument to protect the executive against parliament. Turkey may be an example where the Constitutional Court was established as a guardian of the secular state against religious parties, and as a matter of fact, the Turkish Constitutional Court prohibited over time almost, I think, 28 political parties, most of them religious parties. But rational choice, in my view, is not explaining everything. And it is not true, in my view, that political actors only think strategically, and that they only are motivated by personal or institutional self-interest. I think that ideas and principles matter, not alone, but together with other motives. They matter particularly after a fundamental break in a country's history with the past regime. South Africa, I think, is a good example for this, where President Mandela defended the court vigorously even after he had experienced a bitter defeat by the court. But he went public on TV and said, this is the job of the court, and if we were wrong in understanding the Constitution, they did what they should have done. And what the realists not take into account, I think, is that constitution making in many cases is not just the dictate of a majority, but it is a consensus among future political rivals, or at least a compromise among in favor of constitutional courts. Sometimes are only sort of an imitation. I think this was the case in a number of former socialist countries after 1989. The desire to become again, or become for the first time, part of the Western political and legal culture was very dominant after the end of the communist regime. Western-type constitutions were adopted. There were not many original ideas in these countries, and judicial review was regarded just as an integral part of the project of constitutionalism in the Western understanding. Now, the conflicts between the political branches of government and constitutional courts occur in each of these constellations. Constitutions impose constraints on politics, and constitutional courts enforce these constraints. So the possibility of conflict between courts and politicians, it's inbuilt into the system. It's normal. It's not an abnormal thing. Abnormal are pressures on constitutional courts. Conflicts are least likely to happen in the hegemonic setting, at least as long as the original majority remains in place. They have nothing to fear from a like-minded court. But the fact that political rivals agreed in founding in the constitutional moment on judicial review does not immunize the court against political pressure. Jurisprudence of the court may take an unexpected turn. Politicians may face unexpected challenges. And then the court appears as an obstacle against pursuing what in the mind of the politicians is necessary for the best of the country. And the likelihood of conflict grows when the generation of the founders leave. The heroic time of revolution, of reconstruction is over. Politics as usual take place. The court is no longer seen as self-imposed by politicians, but as an external constraint. And this it may be especially so if countries are in a deep crisis, whose solution requires unorthodox means, and then the government meets a hostile court. And precisely this was the constellation of the first example of a court under political pressure that I want to treat. And this is the United States in the Great Depression that started 1929. An economic crisis to which the then acting President Hoover who had just announced, by the way, the end of poverty in the United States, to which Hoover had no answer. Roosevelt had an answer. The answer was called the New Deal. And Roosevelt won the election of 1932 and took office in 1933 and immediately enacted a number of laws that were designed to cope with the problem. But law after law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court firmly adhered to its jurisprudence from the so-called Lochner area, insisted on liberty of contract as almost a super fundamental right, regardless of the object, of the circumstances, or the consequences of contracts. So the question for Roosevelt was how to get around the court. And the answer depended, of course, on the source of the problem. And there was a lot of discussion in Washington about what was the source of the problem. Was the source the Constitution? Then, of course, constitutional amendment would have been the answer. Was the source the interpretation of the Constitution? Then the judges were the problem, and something had to be done about the judges. Historians have counted in this period 102 draft laws to tame the court, and 60 motions to amend the Constitution. None of them was materialized. And a number of ideas were ventured that play a role until these days. So, for instance, elevate the quorum for declaring something unconstitutional, only two-thirds with a two-thirds majority. Or establish the override, like Canada and the UK and New Zealand have it. Roosevelt himself was thinking of adding loyal judges to the court. This is known to everybody who has a little information about the court-packing plan of Roosevelt. But he waited. He was rather patient. He waited for the next election taking place in 1936. And this was a triumphal victory. Only 2 states of the 50, no, less than 50 at that time, maybe 48 or 49 states voted for the other party. And 9 New Deal laws were still waiting in the Supreme Court. And so he announced the court-packing plan. The plan was the following. The plan would have given him the right to appoint a new justice for every justice who reached or was over age of 70 and was not willing to resign. And this was at that time true for 6 out of the 9 US Supreme Court justices. And so his plan would have allowed him to bring the number of 9 immediately to the number of 15, and that would have given him a majority. Despite of Roosevelt's vast majority in Congress, the plan met a lot of protest. Even in his own political party. The debate was sharp. Roosevelt was compared to Hitler, to Mussolini, to Stalin. The final vote was never taken. In March 1937, Justice Roberts switched sides. West Coast Hotel was the famous landmark case. And from now on, Roberts voted with the critics of Lochner. And so the support of the court-packing plan diminished. Then it happened shortly afterwards that another hardliner, Justice Van Deventer, resigned. And therewith the plan of court-packing was dead. But at the end of his presidency, because of vacancies, Roosevelt had the chance to fill 8 vacancies. The biggest number of appointees that ever a president of the United States could appoint. More or less at the same time, the Austrian Constitutional Court, as I said, the first court as a specialized constitutional court, say not the Israeli system, but the continental system later on, the Austrian court got under political pressure. Austria, after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, became a parliamentary democracy, but the new system was never completely accepted in the Austrian society. It was a very rifted society, and this affected, of course, the functioning of the parliamentary system of democracy. And the political camps were irreconcilable. And different difficulties were not only treated in parliament, but they were treated in the streets. The three major political groups had military, paramilitary forces, and there were street fights in Vienna and other places of Austria going on. So the call for the transformation of the parliamentary democracy into an authoritarian system increased day by day. The right-wing Catholic Dollfuss government found an excuse to go ahead in March 1933, that's to say exactly the Roosevelt American time. After a tumultuous debate in the parliament, the president and the two vice presidents of the parliament stepped down, and the government interpreted this as a self-dissolution of parliament. And attempts of the deputies to assemble again were prevented by police force. From now on, the government ruled by decree. It derived the authorization for ruling by decree from a wartime emergency law of 1917. The emergency law gave the executive the power to take the necessary measures to reconstruct the economy and to guarantee the food supply for the population. The measures that were now taken by the Austrian government were clearly not covered by this emergency law. So the emergency law was challenged in the Constitutional Court, and no one doubted that the court would declare all these laws by decree null and void. So Austria was in front of the Dollfuss government was in front of the American question, how to prevent the court from deciding against the government. The answer was different. The answer was not to add judges to the court, but to eliminate judges from the court, so to say, negative court packing plan, if you want. Yeah. Much more difficult to reach, of course, in a way compatible with the Constitution. The attempts to convince judges to resign voluntarily were only successful, or could only be successful, with regard to Dollfuss' own party. They were not sufficient to paralyze the court.
You shouldn't give ideas to our politicians. I'm very worried about it.
I thought they were not present in this meeting.
Maybe not, yeah.
So the government decided to amend the statute of the Constitutional Court, again based on the emergency law of 1917. The amendment is difficult to understand if one doesn't know how the Austrian court was composed and appointed. Judges elected by Parliament, 6 members upon proposition of the government, 3 on proposition of the upper house of Parliament, 3 on proposition of the lower house of Parliament. And the amendment said, judges elected upon the proposal of the 2 houses of Parliament may only sit in cases if all judges out of this group appointed by Parliament are present. The argument was otherwise the political balance, the party balance would be distorted. So what was achieved by this amendment? It sufficed to convince one judge appointed by Parliament not to sit, that all the judges appointed by Parliament, all 6, were disabled to sit. So remained the 6 judges appointed by the government. This was even a greater distortion of the political balance, of course, because the government is not above the parties, it's also a party government. Now, when the appeal to the court was ready for decision, the president of the court complied with the amended law and invited only the 6 judges nominated by the government. And so the court stood in face of the preliminary question, do we reach the quorum in order to decide cases? The answer depended, of course, on the constitutionality of the amendment, but the court decided to apply the amended law and decided that it was precluded from deciding. So the government had free hands. The court was abolished. A new constitution was adopted that transferred Austria into an authoritarian corporate state, which remained in place until Hitler annexed Austria. There's not much more to be said about the first half of the 20th century because there are no more courts, or almost no more courts with the power of judicial review. But the two early examples already contain some patterns that repeated themselves in later periods. I briefly analyze these examples by distinguishing between the situation, the goal, the means, and the outcome. The US situation was paradigmatic. A political party wins an election, maybe with an overwhelming victory, and wants to implement its program. The court stands in the way. The goal is to get the legislation through the court, which is in itself not openly unconstitutional. Non-reproachable means would be, of course, constitutional amendment. But what if a constitutional amendment is not available, either legally or, as in the United States, practically? Roosevelt's answer: create a government-friendly court by packing. Was that unconstitutional or not? Openly not. I mean, the number is not fixed in the Constitution. The US Supreme Court started with 5 and then was enhanced. Life tenure, which is in the Constitution, was not affected. But problematic, of course, was the function. Can the court continue to exercise its function as a guardian of the Constitution vis-à-vis the government if it is backed by loyal friends of the government? The question remains open because the plan was not implemented. The chance that it would have been implemented was low anyway. There was media opposition. There was opposition within the political system. There was, as I said, even opposition within Roosevelt's party. So the court had a lot of support inside the political system and outside the political system. The Austrian situation was quite different. No landslide victory of a political party. The government itself created the situation by paralyzing parliament and ruling by decrees in a constitutionally doubtful way. Like in the US, the court stood in the way. The goal in Austria went beyond a government-friendly court. It was considered as a necessary step on the way to transform the political system. And the means were eliminating judges and, in addition, amend the rules on the functioning of judicial review. So the measures were court curbing, and these are still up to now the two most important ways: court packing, court curbing. This was clearly unconstitutional, and the question of constitutionality appealed before the court. Did the court have a chance? The preliminary question whether the amendment of the statute was constitutional could have given the court a tool. The court decided not to use it. The court decided to apply the amended rules. Is this compelling? Also a question that reappears in present cases. If you review the constitutionality of the new rules by applying the new rules, what you do is you identify the object of the review with the measure, the criterion of the review, and this is logically impossible. So the court should have, and I think this is the only way to behave correctly, should have reviewed the amendments according to the old rules. And then the result would have been a different one. Whether it would have helped the court longer than a month is another question. My next example, and I see that I will run out of time much more than I had been afraid of anyway. My next example is Russia, and I only mention briefly and then go on to two present cases. I only briefly mention that the situation in Russia was again a different one, because in Russia the constitutional court that was established after the fall of communism intervened in a period of time where the power question in Russia was not solved. There was a new constitution. The new constitution was unclear about the question, will it be a parliamentary system? Will it be a presidential system? Behind the parliamentary groups were the old elites, behind those in favor of presidential system were the reformers, also former communists. So the power question was open, and the Constitutional Court, that was endowed with enormous powers, even with the power to avail itself of problems, didn't have to wait for applications. The court thought that it would be the right mediator in this situation, and the court could only lose in a situation as this where the power question has not been solved. So what Yeltsin did was he solved the question by sending the tanks to parliament, and he suspended the Constitutional Court, wrote a new constitution, reenacted, was a surprise, he reenacted the Constitutional Court even with the same judges, but stripped them from certain powers that they have had previously. I think one could mention other examples for this pattern, where courts intervene in a time where the power question and the system question is not yet solved. So in cases of uncertainty of what the political system will be, and this is almost a situation where the court will necessarily fail. What we observe today, and there I approach two cases that you briefly mentioned already. What we observe today reminds on first glance of the US situation. And it reminds, on the other hand, of the Austrian goal and the Austrian means, yet different from Austria in the name of democracy. And it happens in a number of countries currently, and even in member states of the European Union. And the two examples I will briefly discuss are Hungary and Poland. Countries with, after the communist regime, particularly strong constitutional courts, very successful courts in the period of transition, extremely active, at least the Hungarian court, which declared almost 1/3 of all laws that it had to review unconstitutional. And when politicians asked whether this is really necessary, the then President Schuljom, as he told me himself, said this is Western standard, which was of course by no means true. I think my court may have declared less than 10% of the laws are constitutional. Now, the situation in these countries, Hungary and Poland, a former opposition party wins a comfortable majority in free elections. In Hungary, the Fidesz party wins the election of 2010 with 53% of the votes, and that translates into a 2/3 majority. That's to say, a majority that allows to amend the constitution. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party, PiS, wins the 2015 election with 36% of the votes that translate into an absolute majority. Different from the United States. The problem is not for these two countries certain legislative acts that fail in the Constitutional Court. The problem for these parties rather is the existence of an institution with the power to annul majority decision. Other institutions that would make the life for majorities difficult also become targets. Judiciary in general, independent media, ombudsman, etc. The goal is, like in Austria, a more authoritarian system, and the constitutional courts are the foremost target. The ways and means differ in both of these countries, and the reason is the different majority that they gained in the election. Fidesz, with its 2/3 majority in Hungary, has a sufficient majority to establish all its goals on constitutional level. Poland, with an absolute majority, has not a sufficient number of mandates to amend the constitution. So the changes have to be done by way of legislation, and that is subject to judicial review. Now, Hungary was, even many years after the fall of communism, under the communist constitution, but heavily amended. Fidesz aimed at a new constitution. But there was one obstacle. The previous parliament had made a new constitution dependent on a prior statute that regulated the procedure of constitution making, and this statute could only be adopted by a 4/5 majority. So the first step of the new Hungarian government was to amend this amendment and to do away with this amendment. So the way was free to draft a new constitution. I don't deal with this new constitution because parallel to the work of drafting a constitution, the statute on the Constitutional Court was amended immediately. First of all, appointment of judges. Before Fidesz came to power, the political parties nominated candidates for 11 positions, but only a plurality of parties could name a candidate. Not one party was sufficient, but several parties had to unite to nominate a candidate, and then Parliament elected with a 2/3 majority. The president of the court was elected by the judges, not by Parliament. The new government employed a mixture of pecking and curbing. The number of judges was elevated from 11 to 15. The tenure was eliminated, it was extended from 9 to 12 years. You remember that I said the longevity, the permanence of the judiciary makes it a especially good tool in order to keep a government in power, even if it loses the election. The nomination right was transferred from the political parties to a parliamentary committee, where, of course, the party with a 2/3 majority had the majority, so nominations could only come from the Fidesz party. Election in parliament, again with 2/3, which didn't matter anymore. President was no longer elected by the judges, but by the parliament. The judges are no longer irremovable. They can be dismissed if they are unworthy, whatever that means. And the actio popularis that existed in Hungary was abolished. The changes gave Fidesz the chance to immediately add 4 new judges. But this was not sufficient to secure a Fidesz majority in the Hungarian Constitutional Court. The court, as a matter of fact, declared some of the laws of the new government unconstitutional. The court even reviewed amendments to the constitution. The laws that were declared unconstitutional were immediately the next day reenacted by way of a constitutional amendment, so that you now have the Hungarian constitution full of what would be ordinary law in a normal state. Review of amendments was limited to the formal correctness of the amendment. Laws with financial implications were exempted from review. If a judgment imposed payments on government or had financial consequences, the government was authorized to levy extra taxes to finance these burdens. With the new constitution adopted in 2011 and in force as of January 2012, all constitutional court decisions before January 1st, 2012 were declared irrelevant. The court was prohibited from referring to them and from citing them in judgments. In the meantime, Fidesz could fill 5 vacancies. The court is no longer a threat for this party. And it even allowed Fidesz to react to some criticism of the Venice Commission and the EU by repealing some of the provisions in the statute on the Constitutional Court. If pecking of the court is successful, curbing is no longer that important, and vice versa. If curbing is successful, pecking is no longer that important. Poland. The ambition of the Peace Party in Poland is similar to those of Fidesz in Hungary, but of course more difficult to realize because the constitution is not at the disposition of the government, so it's limited to ordinary lawmaking. The first step in a long battle that ensued after the election was, I have to say, that done by the old majority. In May 2015, the candidate of PiS won the presidential election. The then ruling party was afraid to lose the parliamentary election that would follow a few months later. And in the last session of the old parliament, they elected 5 justices to the Constitutional Court. They were called the October justices. 3 for seats that were already vacant. 2 for seats that would become vacant only when the new parliament was active. So this clearly fits into Herschel's picture of constitutional review as a hegemonic project, like Hungary. But not on the stage of constitution making, but on the stage of ordinary reform. The president of Poland refused to take the oath of all 5 October judges. The new parliament challenged the election of the October judges and amended the statute on the Constitutional Court. Among others, ended prematurely the tenure of the president and the vice presidents. The opposition challenged the amendments before the Constitutional Court. The parliament declared the election of the 5 October judges void. It elected 5 new ones. The president took the oath immediately after election, shortly after midnight. So these are the midnight judges of the new parliament, as opposed to the October judges of the old parliament. The Constitutional Court decided the election of 3, where the vacancies already existed, was constitutional. The election of 2, where vacancies were not yet, but coming in the future, were unconstitutional. The amendments to the statute of the Constitutional Court were partly unconstitutional. The government refused to publish the decision, which means that it doesn't take legal force, and enacted a new statute. All cases have to be decided by the full court, 15 members. A quorum of 13 is necessary that the court can sit and decide. Decisions that declare something unconstitutional need a 2/3 majority. Cases have to be decided in the order that they arrive. Parliament can end the office of individual judges. This was not less than paralyzing the court. The court, with this order of things, is no longer able to do its function. The statute was challenged, of course. The court reviewed this statute. Now the Austrian question comes up, according to which criteria, the old ones or the new ones. The Polish court decided that only the old rules can be applied in order to adjudicate the constitutionality of the new ones. So it declared the statute unconstitutional on this basis. The government refused to publish the decision. And a further amendment was also declared unconstitutional. But by mid-2017, the Peace Party had a safe majority in the constitutional courts. So again, like in Hungary, some of the amendments of the statutes were repealed in order to please the European Union, but it didn't matter anymore. There are many more cases than time for this lecture. You may have noticed that I avoided to talk about Israel because everybody in this room knows more about Israel than myself.
We know now that there is a lot to expect.
Yes, that's true.
I don't think, I end with a few remarks. I don't think that judicial review is indispensable for constitutionalism. We have well-functioning constitutional democracies without judicial review. Nor do I think that judicial review is irreconcilable with democracy, as many think, and as is an obsession in the United States. I also think that the conditions for constitutional adjudication can be changed. If the provisions are in the Constitution, they can be changed by constitutional amendment. If they are regulated in a statute, they can change by amending ordinary law. Judicial review does not antedate the Constitution, but it is a creature of the Constitution. But I think there are limits. If the Constitution establishes judicial review by a constitutional court, amendments to the Constitution or laws that prevent the court from exercising its function cannot be deemed constitutional. But apart from that, I think what really matters when it comes to these experiences is the purpose behind the amending of laws or statutes. Poland and Hungary argue that every single new element in their constitution can be found in a constitution or in a statute of some other well-functioning democratic country. But the conglomeration makes a difference and the purpose makes a difference. So I think one should look for the purpose. And the purpose in Hungary and Poland are part of the general backsliding of liberal democracy that we can face presently. The purpose is to establish more authoritarian governments, and this is justified, and this is new, I think. This is new, it is justified in the name of democracy. Yet it is a concept of democracy that is alien to the achievement of democratic constitutionalism. These forces identify democracy with majority rule, and they identify the majority party with the people. If this is true, if this identification holds true, then declaring a parliamentary law null and void means obstructing the will of the people. And this is exactly the way these parties argue in the countries affected. The people, in turn, are regarded as homogeneous, capable of having a uniform will. And minorities in this understanding place themselves outside the people. They are enemies that may be silenced or eliminated. Carl Schmitt comes to the front behind all these ideas of this understanding of democracy. But the people in the understanding of these parties is not the empirical people, the people that you find in the streets. It is not the. It is a people with not a people with an ascertainable will. It's an imaginated people with a hypothetical will. In reality, we always have a plurality of convictions, of opinions, of interests. And this plurality is legitimate in a system that is based on the autonomy of the individual and that formulates its purposes and its limits of public power from this premise of autonomy of the individual. So the elected majority can never be identified with the people, and it therefore can never have an unlimited and uncontrolled mandate to rule. The chance of the minority to become majority is an essential element of democracy. And the reforms of which the changes of judicial review and constitutional courts are only a part, are attempts to perpetuate the rule of the majority, even if it should lose an election, because even if the opposition win, it will not have room to legislate and act in its way. The opposition is a constitutive element of democracy, and this is why it is so frustrating to see that this is happening even in the European Union, and it's so frustrating to see that the European Union is without effective means to deal with situations like this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I will take the walls, and maybe a Polish court, you see the future of the Israeli legal system. Well, you didn't say this, but you said something
delicate.
which is slightly more delicate, but slightly. I want to mention three aspects of the Israeli system that makes it very difficult, especially prone to the problem of absence of judicial review. Professor Grimm has said that judicial review is not necessary for a healthy constitutional system, and I agree with him. But there are three aspects of the Israeli system that ought to be mentioned. First of all, we have one house of parliament, which makes it very easy to pass laws. Secondly, we are not subject to the European Court, which is very sad. I wish we were. Maybe you will accept us. And the third is that we are a parliamentary system, as you are. which means that the government has a lot of power over legislation. And those three aspects together makes it particularly urgent, I think, to have judicial review. I'll give the floor to Professor and Chief Justice Barak.
My friends and guests, I would like to thank Dieter for agreeing to honor all of us here with his presence and for his broad and thought-provoking lecture. I heard it before. I would also like to thank the Law School of the Hebrew University, my alma mater, and Dean Michael Kariani for establishing this series of lectures and for inviting as the first speaker my dear friend, Dieter. In my comments, short, I would like briefly to address two topics. First, I would like to show that we in Israel are undergoing similar processes to those that Dieter described. Secondly, I would like to address the question of how Supreme Court justices may act under the difficult conditions that have been created. And let me start with the first. Right now, Israel is also undergoing a process where illiberal foundations are gaining strength in our constitutional democracy. There is a concern that we are at the top of a slippery slope. More statutes are being passed by the Knesset, and more bills are being presented to the Knesset that are meant to interfere with the delicate balance between majority rule and individual rights that exists in a democracy, the balance between the we and the I. The tendency is to see democracy as solely majority rule on the rise. The intellectual packaging for these activities is, of course, the argument that the judges were not elected by the people, and they therefore lack the democratic legitimacy to void statute passed by the people's elected representatives. Through this argument, the constitutional democracy abandons the restraints, foundations of checks and balances, turns into a tyranny of the majority, a dictatorship of the majority. The first wave of attacks against the Supreme Court in Israel and its judges was the attempt to undermine the popular faith in the judiciary. It was expressed in statements such as, the Supreme Court is a branch of a far left political party. No religious person has a chance to receive justice in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court prevents the IDF from winning the war on terror. The second wave of attacks on the Supreme Court and its judges came through recommendations to change the Supreme Court's authority and to revoke the powers of judicial review over primary legislation, to revoke the ability to submit petitions in the public interest, to revoke the court's authority to hear petitions regarding the constitutionality of the state of activity in the occupied territories, to revoke the Supreme Court authority to declare constitutional amendment as unconstitutional, to revoke the court's authority to declare that the law was not passed through the necessary procedures, to legislate an override clause that would enable a regular coalition majority of the Knesset to enact a statute that disproportionately infringes upon constitutional rights. The third wave of attacks on the Supreme Court and its judges was expressed through the desire to alter the way that judges are appointed. At first, the recommendation was to reduce the power of the 3 judicial representatives on the Judicial Appointment Committee. Afterwards came a declared attempt to appoint judges who think like us. Judicial candidates were disqualified if they were suspected of being committed to human rights. This, my dear Dieter, is the state of affairs in Israel. I think that you were very wise in deciding not to devote a chapter of your lecture to Israel. And now I will proceed to the second topic, which is the question of how should Supreme Court justices act in those circumstances. What can they do when there are threats that the court will be flattered by a DC bulldozer? How should they think when they are considering a petition whose outcome could affect the institutional authority of the Supreme Court and the method of appointing its justices? The first possibility is to totally ignore all these threats and the potential damage to the court statute and authority. Any considerations of these external factors is unacceptable and would impinge on judicial discretion. The eyes of the goddess of justice are covered so that she won't take these types of consideration into account either. The court must only consider the principles relevant to the case at hand, and those external considerations are not a factor. The court is a form of principle, not a form of politics. Taking these considerations into account will damage the court and its justices, and they will never be able to free themselves of the deviation that would be taken from their own discretion. Choosing to do so would turn the rule of the Constitution and the rule of law into hostage in the hands of those who would use threats and slander the pressure on the court. Justices may not even be able to accurately assess the nature and severity of the threat on the court's status and authority. A second contradictory option is to take these external factors into consideration. According to this option, maintaining the court's status and authority is no less important than the decision in a given dispute. The court is obliged to protect its institutional authority and its esteemed status in society. I could expand on each of these conflicting approaches. Suffice to say that between the two, I believe that only the first approach can be considered. I myself would certainly prefer to resign than to choose the second approach. I do not know any judge who would choose the second option. Therefore, in my opinion, there is only one option on the table, and that is the first one. It is the only option open for discussion. The question is there any way to give the second option's consideration some sort of expression within the framework of the first option? Does the first option demand fiat justitia et pareat mundus, let justice be done and let the world perish? Here I would like to offer two ideas, each of which can be considered. The first idea is based on the understanding that hard cases exist in law. I discussed these cases at length in my book on judicial discretion. As far as the judge's role is concerned, these cases are typified by the fact that the legal problem at hand has more than one correct solution. Two judges could employ conflicting interpretive methods without either of them exercising his or her discretion improperly. It is obvious to everyone that if in a legal problem there is only one single answer, every judge must deliver it. No external discretion can change it. However, when a legal question has more than one correct solution, a judge may find himself in a severe internal dilemma, as he may choose between either of the two correct solutions. How should he act in those hard cases? In this book on judicial discretion, I stated that in these hard cases, the judge acts in light of his or her own judicial philosophy. A judge could prefer, in a balanced case, for example, considerations of free speech over consideration of reputation, considerations of individual rights over consideration of public interest. I think that in these hard cases, a judge may also consider the effect of his or her ruling on the status of the Supreme Court as one of the central powers of the state. This concept can only apply in hard cases, where the legal problem that the judge is considering has more than one correct solution. The second idea applies in a situation where the court has decided that a statute infringes upon constitutional rights contrary to the mandate of the basic law, and within this framework of the first option we discussed, the statute is therefore unconstitutional and void. In this framework, the court can give limited expression to the external considerations we mentioned. Here are two examples. Firstly, when writing the ratio of the decision, the judge can provide a narrow explanation, avoiding high rhetorics. And when choosing between the various legal arguments that support the decision, he can focus on the argument that will raise the least opposition. Second, regarding the constitutional remedy, a judge can consider the constitutional dialogue and can rule, for example, a proportional suspension before the remedy of voidness comes into effect, in order to allow the legislature to find a proportionate solution to the legal vacuum that the remedy will create. Note that these ideas can only apply where the court has decided, without taking these external factors into account, that the statute is unconstitutional and void. Well, when I wrote the book Judicial Discretion, I could not have imagined that the Supreme Court would have to contend with the present challenges that it has been confronted with. I did not foresee the rise of illiberal democracy in Israel. I did not envision a DC bulldozer raising the Supreme Court. To my great sorrow, however, that is currently reality. I thank you, my dear friend Dieter, for making us all think about those issues. They reinforce my conviction that we cannot take democracy for granted, and that in order to preserve democracy, we must fight for it. Because at the end of the day, if we do not protect democracy, democracy will not protect us. Thank you.
Do you want to respond anything, or we should start? Oh, yeah. I think there is an interesting contrast between the two talks in the sense that Professor Grimm has enlightened us about other jurisdiction. Professor Grimm has enlightened us about other jurisdiction, not his own. And Professor Barak, of course, talked about Israel, and this is very indicative that I think Germany is not in the same trouble as Israel is now. This is my suspicion.
Not yet.
But
It could happen everywhere.
it could happen everywhere. But now the opposition, Ut Gavizon.
I mean, this is nice and fine, but this is really, I think. I must say I was surprised at the beginning that this would be such an intimate evening. But then I am very glad it is, because this is not like the previous talk we had with Chief Justice Barak commenting, that was really a talk to the general public about ideals, human rights, and human dignity.
Sorry,
This
which
is more or
talk?
less-
Which talk?
Huh?
Which
This
talk?
is the Rosalia Bella.
Ah, yeah, I don't know.
Anyway, this is our friends, the legal elites, the academic. This is not newspapers. We are not going to see probably headlines. And this is a very good opportunity to discuss the complexity of the story that we've heard from Professor Bremer, which is extremely complex. And I agree that what is happening in Hungary and Poland is relevant now to what is happening in many other countries now, and that this is relevant to Israel. I'm completely with this assessment. However, I think we should take seriously the lessons to be drawn from the marvelous and unbelievably informative text that we have heard. And then I would like to say something about what Professor Barak has just said. I think it's true that constitutionalism and judicial review over legislation is not a legal issue. This is a political, constitutional, meta-legal issue. and the conditions for effective judicial review, which is necessary to limit the power of governments, depend on the basic social structures and attitudes of the society in question to the relationships between the agencies. I will go back and take the American case, which I think is extremely indicative. It ended without power, and as we heard, it probably is the case that Roosevelt, despite being a very popular president, could not have passed his packing the court plan because his own party objected to it on constitutional, not political reasons. But the court did what I think Justice Barak probably wouldn't allow it to do, and the court said, enough is enough. We have done this for a whole term. We saw the people, we saw the elections, we had this discussion with Aharon. The people have said something, and we should listen. So the court changed course. Now, was it then not liberal? Was it so progressive that it now said freedom of contract is not sufficiently important? No. It said the challenges are such that government needs the power to do things that are necessary to make these people employed again, and this is critical for the well-being of our country, and we cannot and should not stop it in the name of law. This is Holmes' Inaugural. Okay, so now what does follow from all of this? I think that it's extremely important to see the basic social structure. And I think we need to say, when we come back to Israel, that it's not about jurisprudence, and it's not about liberalism and illiberalism. Liberal democracy is ambiguous. It's between liberal democracy in the Rawlsian sense, that is an open society, and liberal democracy in the sense that liberals are always the ones in power. So there is liberal versus, say, autocracy, but there is a liberal democracy vis-à-vis conservative democracy. If conservative democracy is not a legitimate form of democracy with a commitment to the rule of law and human rights, then liberal democracy is no democracy. It's only democracy when liberals are in power. This is a very different thing. Now, I do not accept that the only place where judges are allowed to think broadly about their role, especially in constitutional courts. I think Kelsen was very wise in distinguishing between regular courts and constitutional courts. So a constitutional court is by definition also public and political. The fact that it takes cases and does it legally is very important, but it's a constitutional court. It's not a regular court. And I think the obligation of judges is always to take these things into consideration. And there is no, I'm against this jurisprudential theory, I've always been, but there is no one right answer. The fact that a court can have bitter disagreements within the court with all judges committed to searching the interpretation of the law suggests that at least phenomenologically there is no right answer, one right answer. So since this is the case, I think that constitutional courts and regular courts, when they undertake constitutional judgments, should always be oriented to the general theme. And in Israel, you cannot understand what's going on without understanding the history of the constitutional revolution and the processes that it started.
I think, do you want to address or?
Yeah. Do I need the microphone?
Yeah. I think you cannot be held.
That, first of all, interesting. Secondly, I approve of a lot, but I mentioned what I do not approve of. I don't think that interpreting constitutional law and applying constitutional law to cases is meta-juridical. I think it is a juridical operation as every other one, and the only difference is that in the Constitution you would find more open-ended norms than you would find, let's say, in the civil code, if you have a civil code, or in a procedural law. But the operation of concretizing the general norm with regard to the facts at hand is, for me, a legal operation. When you say constitutional courts are political, I agree, but I would like to differentiate a little bit. In which way are they political? They are political because the object of constitutional adjudication is always politics. The Constitution imposes rules on politics, the court enforces these rules, the object is always political. So if you think a court is already political, if the object of decision is political, then you cannot agree to constitutional adjudication. Secondly, the effect is also always political. If the object is political, then the effect of the decision, either you can conclude this treaty, you can send troops to Kosovo, you can uphold this law and enforce this law, is always political effect. So the question remains, is the way of finding the meaning of the Constitution with regard to the case also a political operation? This is a general assumption in the United States, I think, more or less general assumption. Judges do something else than they purport to do. They decide outcome-oriented and find later on legal arguments that support it. This is not my experience of my 12 years in the Constitutional Court. But the way of finding the result is an operation where legal arguments count, but it's often what is qualified as a legal argument. An originalist would find something, a non-legal argument, what someone who has a purposive way of interpreting can accept as a legal argument. So, but it is according to legal arguments, and political and economic and religious and what do I know arguments are excluded. The fact that judges disagree is not an argument against it, because they agree in legal argumentation. And this is perhaps one problem in Aharon's suggestions. In my view, the vast majority of cases are hard cases. And only the smaller number is easy cases. Normally the easy cases where reading the text gives you the answer, don't reach the court. Usually they are hard cases. So for me and in my experience, this was the normal job, to deal with hard cases, and I felt myself under an obligation to find the solution of which I thought it is the correct one, accepting that others could also have had a correct solution, but I, as the individual judge, had to make up my mind up to the point where I said the case has to be decided this way. And then I have respect for the others, but I still think this is not the best way of arguing. So this would be my observations, so that I come to the conclusion, if judges operate as they should, and in many cases they do not operate as they should, then the court is not a political institution in the sense that parliament, political parties, government are political institutions. And what I would do in cases of which we talk tonight, I really don't know, because I haven't ever been in this situation. And I do not know not that the German court has never been in that situation. The early years were difficult, but after the early years up to now, our situation is a very comfortable situation. But what I would do if I find myself in a situation where I say, if I decide the way I think the case should be decided, this will be the end of the court, what will I do? I don't know.
We have Professor Adai, we have Chief Justice Grunis, and we have Chief Justice Englard, and I think then we'll end. Professor Adai.
Firstly, it's such a great pleasure to hear you two great judges. It is a great pleasure to hear you two great judges. I would like to relate to Professor Grimm, Justice Grimm, the idea that there can be functioning democracy without judicial review. And I'd like to ask you, to give examples of the ways and where this has, in your view, in modern political history taken place. My general comment, I wanted to hear how it's happening as well. The general impression from both your lectures is the concentration on the connection between the political hegemony and the judicial independence, or lack of judicial independence. And I've spent many years now in the UN human rights system. And many countries, not just Western European countries, with the European Court of Human Rights, but especially the Latin American countries in the Inter-American Court, and there were attempts in other parts of the world as well to cede the judicial review, in a sense, power to supranational courts, and that has the conceptual impact of depoliticizing the exercise of judicial review. Because it's clearly not involved with local political politics, political party politics, and in fact many of the decisions made by regional and international courts seem to be able to be freer to make firm human rights assessments about the cases that reach them than national supreme courts are, in my opinion. I think that this shows something very important, and that is that the way I see it is that since the Second World War, particularly since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was realized that democracy is not the question if we're talking about majority rule or political party parliamentarism. The question is human rights, and therefore I go back to my first question: don't judges within national courts have to apply human rights, international human rights, because there are international human rights to which the countries are committed, and how can this be done without judicial review?
Professor.
Because New Zealand has the override, like the UK, but they have judicial review with a limited effect now, but the others not. But also for the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries, I have to make a reservation, because they use now the European Convention of Human Rights to review laws which they would not be allowed to do under their own constitution. But still, this is a different thing from having a court whose sole object or function is to review law. I also think that these democracies that can work without judicial review are a happy few, where the conditions for rule of law respect are particularly great, and one never knows how long that will last. I would never recommend to a country that has not this tradition to do without judicial review. But we know, of course, better than we knew 1989 and 1990 that constitutional courts can miss their function. Yeah, we were always happy, I think most people were happy, when ever more constitutional courts were established, because we thought this is the ultimate, someone said this is the ultimate rule of law effect. And we know how easy it is to make them, to turn them into instruments of government, so that they are disabled from fulfilling their true function. But if they do it, I think it is an asset that for most countries would be recommendable. You agree, even if you think it's metapolitics. On the basis of your assumption, you can agree with this. So what I see is that in the interpretation of national bills of rights, international human rights instruments gain ever more importance. And I think that is correct. Sometimes the standard of international human rights law is lower than the standard of national human rights law. Then one should stick to the higher standard. But very often international human rights law elevates the national standard of human rights protection. So I think this is a very healthy development.
I just want to answer your remarks previously, and I think what follows from what Ruti said. I don't agree that most of the cases in the Supreme Court are hard cases. I don't agree. I would agree that most of the cases in the Supreme Court are cases in which judges may disagree and the disagreement is legitimate. In this respect, I agree that most of the cases are hard cases. But that was not my question. The question I asked myself is a different. What about me? I as a judge. For me, Banca Mizrahi was an easy case. For me. I agree that other judges thought differently. I think what Cheshin thought was absolutely legitimate. But I thought that that's
It was a very
that's
minimalistic decision.
yeah,
too.
that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with you on the minimalism. That's right. And so the question that I asked myself is, I, as a judge, take into account my judicial philosophy. Is it a case in which I myself am hesitating? I myself don't know which road to take. In those cases, I think I can take into account.
Then we don't have a disagreement.
Then I think
Yeah, it's a different notion of hard case.
that's right.
So it's a subjective versus objective hard cases, I guess. Chief Justice Grunis.
It's not a question to Justice, a question to Justice Green. I confess I know very little about Hungary and Poland, but I wonder, it's an informative question. Do the courts, the previous courts in those countries, do they bear some responsibility to the current situation?
I think there are many reasons for the current situation. One more important than the one you are looking for is, I think, failure of political parties. So the democratic system was in many countries not well functioning, but the fact that the Hungarian Supreme Court was such an extremely active court may have contributed to the impression with the present governing people the court is a dangerous institution and we better get rid of a court that can interfere so deeply into the political process. I wouldn't exclude that. I have no evidence for that, but I wouldn't exclude it. Poland has not the experience. Polish court was a well-functioning, active court, but by far not as active as the Hungarian court. Nevertheless, this court is the same way under attack. Not impossible, but no evidence for that. At least I don't have it.
Professor Englert. Justice Englert, I guess. Whatever. Justice Professor Englert.
Let's see. How to
Can we make it?
Anybody else wants to, because, no?
I want to thank Professor Green for his talk. I would like to add some details which I think are important from the Austrian experience in the 20s. The reason you didn't mention for the abolishment of the Supreme Court in 29 was a decision relating to state and religion. That was the reason that the government, the parliament interfered and licensed all the justices of the Constitutional Court in Austria. The problem was divorce, and there was no divorce in Austria under the Catholic law, and but the government had the possibility to permit bigamy. and a civil court denied the validity of this permission. And the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court,
So it denied the prohibition on divorce
it,
or the bigamy?
it denied without dissolving the marriage to remarry.
Oh,
And the matter came before the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court decided that the administrative decision should stand, and the civil court who decided to annulate the bigamy was wrong. This created a reaction from the Catholic parties, and that brought about the dissolution. Now, what's very interesting, Kelsen, who was a justice of the Constitutional Court, they all were licensed and to be re-elected, and they suggested that he should be appointed by the Social Democratic Party, and Kelsen refused. He said, in principle, he doesn't want to be appointed by a political party, and he left Austria and went to Germany. That was happening in 1929. So my conclusion from the whole history, that's the details. Now, there's a big discussion today if the Constitutional Court was right or wrong. Walter was of the opinion, in Austria, that the decision of the Constitutional Court was legally not correct, but it doesn't matter. My conclusion is that the moment society is deeply divided ideologically about some issues, it constitutes a danger for a constitutional court, whatever it will decide. And that's the experience we have here. The same what happened in Austria in 1929. The Constitutional Court was erected in 1920, and in 1929 it was to hold a change. So what I'm concerned is that the Israeli society is deeply divided about basic ideological issues, and this is the major problem of constitutional jurisdiction, and that's what I wanted to say.
My Austrian example is a few years later, 33, 34, when the court was definitely dissolved. In 29, the judges were dismissed, and
and re-elected.
Re-elected. Yeah. This is a different incident which I did take notice of here for that purpose. The other question, I think, is of immense importance. Which degree of disagreement does a society endure without changing their institutions? Again, I think the German society after World War II was not a harmonious society, but it was not a rifted society. It was rifted only with regard to certain questions. Abortion, for instance. I think abortion was one of the cases where the court lost much of its support for a certain period of time. But it was about this question. Or another one was, there I was already member of the court, was the crucifix in Bavarian classrooms, where the court dramatically lost support in the population. So that
you sat on this case? You sat on this case? I
sat on this case, yeah. So that my colleague Böckenförde, who was in the other panel, told me that the Constitutional Court will never be the same after this crucifix judgment, and I replied it will take a few days longer until it recovers, and that was the case. So we haven't really seen the scenario that you just depicted, and I think that the possibility of a court to solve very, very deep and fundamental disagreement is limited. And the Russian example is not the Israeli example, but next to the Russian example we could mention Thailand, Venezuela. We have other countries where in situations where the society doesn't find peace about such a problem, or at least an agreement, the court will not be able to do it either.
It can be resolved by elections.
Yeah.
This is Thailand.
You want to say something? No?
The question, if you say to take into consideration political arguments, question one is political. Everything has a political effect, and we are in a society very much divided and with a lot of disagreements. But I think we don't have to look what we miss. The question, what do we have in common? And this is a kind of tradition, legal tradition, political tradition, that has also influence on the court. This is part of the way we think, as you say, our legal philosophy has to do with our background. Background, not only individual background, but the background of our society. But we believe, and I think we should, that we need this in our atmosphere. You cannot compare actually, you can learn from the lesson of Austria or Poland, but you cannot compare the situation, of course. The same dangers. Independence of the court is in danger. And I think we should be sure that we need the independence of a court. And we need a very free mind and an individual mind that will find legal solutions. And there are legal solutions, not for every dispute in the society, but for the cases that we have to solve according to our constitutional principles. We do have our Declaration of Independence. We do have things that we share, because if we don't share anything, we don't have what to say on any subject. I think that the atmosphere is not created just because some people or politicians don't like a certain decision. This is not enough. They are not satisfied. It happens always that a party or a person will not be satisfied, and sometimes they are strong enough. But the tradition to respect a court and to respect a legal solution found by the court is one of the things that we have to encourage, because if not, we cannot really function as one society, not only as a court. So I believe that if you think from that point of view, there is a kind of political influence, but this is not the current political problems. With this, we don't have to deal as judges. So those are the dilemmas. The independence should be very clear, and very professional as much as possible. And of course, if you create an atmosphere which is part of our lack of culture, legal culture, and legal tradition, you can easily create an atmosphere that will endanger the court, and then it will endanger democracy too. We are not dependent, if you bring Holland or other countries, but this is part of their old system. It's part of the way of thinking. It's part of the tradition. We are not in the same place, so we have to respect our common basic values and to insist on that.
So good. Well, I'm very happy. I was struck by the Professor. I was struck by the lecture by Professor Grimm. I learned a lot, and the response to Professor Barak showed the similarities and dissimilarities with some of the analogies. And I guess I wanted to draw your attention to a small book which I thought raises some of the problems you speak about when you spoke about, and maybe you have read it, by Jan Müller, called Populism. It's a tiny book, a very effective book, which I think has emphasized what has illustrated the points made by Professor Grimm on the, I guess, conflict between the image of homogeneity, or the pressure of the authoritarian pressure for homogeneity on the one hand, and the importance of pluralism on the other. And I think this is a lesson that we can draw from Professor Grimm's lecture. Thank you very much.